Hello, and welcome to our third module in our Introduction to Mentalization-Based Treatment. In the first two modules, we considered the skill to mentalize, which enables us to reflect on our inner experiences, the things that motivate us and drive our behavior, such as our values, our beliefs, our wishes, desires, and our emotions. These are all the things that drive our behavior, and mentalizing is this capacity to reflect on this in ourselves and in others. We also thought about how mentalizing helps us work through the inevitable misunderstandings that happen in our lives and builds resilience for us in terms of our mental well-being. And we thought a little bit about the relevance of this skill. In this third module, we're going to focus in on one of those aspects of our inner experiences. That's our emotions, which is quite an important aspect of our mental well-being. So as I said, we're going to focus in on this module on our emotions, because there's a link between our emotions and our ability to keep reflecting, to keep mentalizing. I'm going to explore this in the next slide. We also know that emotions are really important in our general mental well-being, and broadly speaking, emotions can get out of balance, and in two ways. They can either become too intense and too strong for us, sort of overwhelming, or at the other end of that spectrum, we can find ourselves a bit numb and a bit cut off from our emotions, and that can equally bring us difficulties in relation to our mental well-being. So we're going to focus today on trying to develop our understanding about emotions. Why do we have them? What's the purpose of them? What are the different types of emotion that we have? How do we recognize them, name them and label them, both in ourselves and in others? And when emotions do become too intense, too difficult to manage, this can be very distressing. So we're going to consider how we might try to manage them. I hope you're not put off by this graph, but I'm going to use it to try to explain the relationship between our mentalizing ability, so our capacity to keep on reflecting on our experiences and the experiences of those that we're engaged with, and our levels of emotional activation or arousal, as it were. So you can see on the graph there at the bottom, moving from left to right, we're looking at our levels of emotional arousal, how emotionally activated we are at any given time. Moving from low emotional activation right at the left-hand side of the graph, as we move to the right, our emotional activation is gradually increasing. Then if we look at the other axis at the left-hand side of the graph, we're looking from the bottom of the graph, moving to the top, and we're looking at our mentalizing, the reflective capacity. You'll see that the dark blue line on the graph, which starts low, and as it moves across from left to right, the levels of mentalizing capacity starts to rise. Then it reaches a point where it doesn't rise anymore, and it starts to go back the other way, and mentalizing ability starts to decrease. So that dark blue line represents our mentalizing ability within ourselves, what we call the evolved mammalian brain. So generally speaking, in evolution, the bit of our brain at the front, what we call the frontal lobe, the bit just behind our forehead, is the most recently evolved part of our brain. So we call that the evolved mammalian brain, and that is the seat of all our mentalizing, because we need it. We need it to evolve this capacity to reflect on ourselves and others as we evolved into becoming a social animal, where we needed to be able to cooperate with each other, needing to negotiate being in a social group. So this is where all of that mentalizing happens, that reflecting on our emotions and on our experiences. So moving from the left-hand side of the graph at the bottom, there where our emotional activation is not very high at all. Therefore, we're not needing to have to mentalize. But gradually, as our emotional activation increases, there's more of a demand for us to need to be able to reflect and mentalize about our experiences. So as we start to move from left to right, things might be happening in our lives that are challenging us to mentalize. So, for instance, see at the right, at the bottom, there in the left-hand corner, I might have just woken up. So I'm semi-conscious, having been asleep. And then the first task, the first thing I have to engage with, it might be a conversation with my partner about whose turn it is to make the tea. So that might start to challenge me a bit. I might be thinking, well, I'm not sure it's my turn. I might have to manage my feelings during that conversation. And as I go to make the tea, I discover there's no milk in the fridge. So that's going to activate me emotionally a bit more. So my emotional activation starts to increase. I'm having to mentalize a bit more to manage that. I then have a very difficult journey into work. There's lots of traffic on the road and someone cuts me up. It's really challenging my emotions. I'm maybe getting more emotionally activated. Then when I get into work, I have some difficult emails from my boss questioning my performance, which might be making me more emotionally aroused. And then a colleague makes a joke, which I didn't find funny, but I found quite offensive. All of this emotional activation is adding up. And this all adds up. And as it's adding up, it increases our need for mentalizing. But that can reach a threshold point, which we all have, where our mentalizing capacity starts to switch off. And the more primitive parts of our brain, what we call the primitive reptilian brain, starts to take over. So that's our fight-flight response. And the immediate response where our body is preparing itself for facing some kind of threat. And that takes over our ability to mentalize. And our reflective capacity starts to switch off. This happens for all of us. So this is a natural process. And you'll see on the graph that there are two light blue lines, but all of us have varying switch points. So for some of us, we're more able to tolerate increased emotional activation, more so than others. And some of us have that switch point where our fight-flight kicks in earlier. We think the difference between us are to do with both our biology, so our DNA, so what we're born with. Some are more born with the capacity to tolerate this, but also our early experiences and how we're cared for. So that also affects how we're able to tolerate our emotional arousal. So where that switch point kicks in is a mixture of those two things. This can also impact on depending on this switch point can also be impacted on how stressed we are in our lives. So if we think about the current situation with COVID-19 virus, we're all a bit more stressed. So this will be impacting on our emotional activation. So we're now going to develop our understanding around our emotions. We're going to distinguish between what we refer to as basic emotions and more newer social, what can be referred to as secondary emotions. So basic emotions exist in all mammals, while secondary emotions exist in more developed primates, so humans, where there's much more of a need and this link between us becoming social beings and operating in social groups. So basic emotions are localized in the same area in the brain, and they evoke the same physical reactions, and each of them are linked to a set reaction pattern. So in this sense, they're innate. They're inbuilt reactions within us that we don't have to learn because they're almost instinctive within us. And their reaction patterns as they're determined by nature. But we can still distance ourselves from them. So these automatic responses have been important for human survival over the course of our evolution. And the main purpose of them is to do with our survival. So we're now going to start to look a bit more closely at these 7 basic emotions. So if we start off and we think here about fear, it is something that has developed as a signal to us that we might be facing some kind of danger or threat. So a physical reaction in us might be sort of our heart rate increasing, our breathing getting quicker or shallower. And this is the fight-flight response. So getting us to do either fight the threat or run away from it. So it's built into us. If we're facing a tiger in the jungle, we need to notice this and we need to respond quickly to it. Then if we look at anger, so anger is informing us that we're encountering some kind of obstacle, something's getting in our way. The intensity of our anger might be influenced by how important the issue is that we're being blocked by. So that might be connected to how extensive this obstacle is. Now, love and caring. Now, this helps us to care for our offspring, our family, or our social group. And that helps our survival mechanisms. It keeps us taking care of each other. Separation anxiety and sadness. Now, these emotions function as an appeal to others to take care of us. It's like a signal to others to look out for us, that we've lost something or we need something. So our sexual lust, I mean, this is a role in encouraging us to reproduce, to ensure we continue. Play and joy. This can stimulate interaction between others, and it promotes us as a pack animal rather than as individuals. So it enables the development of strategies for difficult situations. So that kind of rough and tumble play, it can be a way of starting to prepare us. Something we don't always think about is the last one, is the sort of interest and curiosity. Now, this is helping us to sort of explore our environment, find things that are useful for us. And this again is really important for our survival. So as we were explaining, the primary, or what we refer to as the basic emotions, they're the ones that are inbuilt, they're innate, they're in us, we're born with these. Whereas the secondary emotions are more complicated in some ways, because they often refer to the feelings you have about that more basic or primary emotion. So these are more learned emotions that we get as we start to develop from being small children, and they can be influenced by how others respond to us. So we'll go on to think a little bit now about what are these, what do these secondary emotions, what are they, what do they look like? So here's a short list of some secondary emotions. It's not an exhaustive list, so you might be thinking of many others, but this is just to give you a sort of understanding and thinking about what some of these emotional states might be. So if we try and link some of them to say the basic emotions, the primary emotions. So if we think about something like anger. So if we get angry, after feeling angry, we might feel a sense of shame. And if we feel maybe something like joy, and we might feel a sense of relief or pride at that. So these are how these first basic emotions can then have this secondary emotion. And these are the ones that we've learned. So we're just going to think a little bit now about emotions and feelings. So as humans, unlike other animals, we have the ability to suppress the feelings of our emotional reaction. And this is why the relationship between emotions and feelings can be a bit confusing. Essentially, when we're referring to emotions, we are including our physical bodily reactions to specific things that we are encountering in our life. The feelings are our conscious experience, or being able to put a word to the physical experience, emotions. And so somewhere in our development as a child, an infant, that process has been learnt. So we've been able to notice that the physical sensation of a heart rate increasing and shallow breath, getting butterflies in your stomach, that's been learnt to know that this is fear. So you could say, I'm feeling frightened. So in that sense, as I said, it's really important that we recognise that we as humans are able to suppress the feelings of our emotional reactions. So I can be having that physical experience of fear, the emotion of it, but I can suppress the conscious recognition of that and have the physical reaction, but not know I'm frightened. And this can happen a lot for those emotions we identified. So essentially, as we developed, we think as a kind of protective mechanism for some, that protects us from the experience of emotions becoming too intense and overwhelming. So we've learned to shut those emotions off. And we can do this too much. So we lose the signal and the benefit of the emotion that we're encountering, something we need to take heed of. This slide is just to give you a visual kind of point of reference of the kind of ways in which emotions can be felt in the body. And it's really just to show where the hot spots are, if you will, with the different emotional states. And in the groups, people can find this quite interesting. When they link, they can look at certain ones and see that pride is very linked to anger. The kind of heat in the body is around the torso and going up, but with anger it goes that goes down into the arms more so. And so yeah, it's just a visual representation of how we might sort of feel things. So just now sort of bringing this section to an end, and some reflections about how do we recognize emotions in others, because this is also really important, so that we can respond to other people. And this can often be by these external cues. So we will see people's expressions, their body language. We'll hear things in their voice, which we'll be able to pick up on. If somebody's getting angry, we can often hear that in their voice. Or we'll see it through their facial expressions and their body language. They'll become very tense. They might grip their fists. So these are all cues to us about what emotional state somebody might be in. But we can also often find ourselves kind of identifying with that at times as well. So what somebody else is experiencing, um, we might feel it. This is in part the basis of what we call empathy, and it's connected to using these mirror neurons in our brains that they enable us to experience what someone else is experiencing. So if somebody's very sad and they're getting upset and they're telling you a very emotional experience, you might feel a sense of sadness in yourself. So you're really connecting with them. Now, these are all just sort of um, clues to what might be happening emotionally for others. So we have to hold in mind what we talked about previously in our mentalizing modules, that it's really important to try and hold on to that stance. So we can't be certain about what someone else might be feeling. So we can certainly get a sense, we pick things up from our external cues within the environment, we might be feeling things, and these are all ways which help us, but we can't absolutely know what's going on for somebody else. And finally, just thinking a little bit about how we recognize emotions in ourselves. So that goes back to what we were just talking about. We do have the capacity to suppress these things in ourselves. So by being emotionally aware, by really starting to try and register what's going on for us in our bodies, if our heart rate is starting to increase, if our hands are sweating, if things are starting to happen, this might be a way of us starting to notice that something's changing. And in order to be able to do that, for some people, it can be very difficult to really notice what's going on for them at that moment. So there's something that we refer to as becoming more mindful. And this is one way in which we can start to really try and slow things down so that we can start to reconnect with our own emotional states. So by trying to stay in the moment and really try to focus what's going on for you at that moment and take your mind to really trying to think about what's going on internally, your inner experience. So mindfulness is a mental state, and it's something that we can all practice and develop. And it's about sort of focusing our awareness on this present moment. So we can really acknowledge and notice those feelings, any thoughts and our bodily sensations. And this can really help us to start to identify those emotional states that are occurring. There's a little, there's just a note here at the bottom of a website, which if anybody is wanting to think a bit more about mindfulness, there's some information on that link around it, and there's certain techniques that you can practice, and it's connected to breathing, or it's sort of visual imagery that can really help you try to slow things down. And if you're in a heightened emotional state, it can also help to calm things down. So here we are at our mentalizing task. So really, I suppose just to emphasize that struggling to regulate emotions can leave people feeling at times very stuck, with some very difficult feelings, and that can lead to quite destructive measures, due to these feelings being unmentalized in some ways, and not understanding the actions and the behaviors. Therefore, it's really important to try and notice when this is happening and to begin to explore sort of alternative options of getting out of a more stuck state of mind, such as turning to another person to ask for help or to get some comfort. So the more we can notice our emotions, and understand them, the better able we are to do this. So the task this week is just to try and make a note of at least one occasion in the week in which you manage to effectively regulate an upsetting emotional state. I mean, you might not have one, but if you do, just to really try and think about that.